How do you see climate change affecting all of this in the next few years?
It's pretty critical. Climate change is not just, first of all, it's real. Let no one tell you otherwise. And the reason why we haven't really distinctly accepted it is because the West can't afford the new technologies to prevent it. And the East, up until now, has viewed the fact they wanted to be Western equivalents as quickly as possible, and they took the shortest possible routes. Maybe in China they're beginning to realise that they are going to inherit the world, and what world they're going to inherit. And you might see more environmental sensitivity from China than anyone else, strangely enough, with that recognition. What it really means is if you can imagine that you had one super empire, and that super empire was the West, and it was industrialised and it was global. And we live in a closed system, and the climate could absorb the outputs from one empire's industrialisation on that level. And along comes a second. Now the first one doesn't disappear, it still has the same industrial complex, it doesn't project the power the same way. You add a second and you create a tipping point, and that tipping point is to a closed system. And we're so through that tipping point. If you look at Al Gore's chart that he first showed of CO2 from ice cores from 800,000 years, and you look at where the CO2 levels are, having broken out the top of that 800,000 year range, you recognise that CO2 is linked to temperature. And if you take the temperature of the planet, and you take where the CO2 levels are and they're implied to be, it's not a 2-degree change or 5-degree change, it's an 11-degree change. And institutionally, no one can even have the courage to talk about the changes which are facing us. And denial is a cultural mechanism humans use when faced with quantum shifts. And that's why we're not dealing with it. And unfortunately, what it does is it changes the way that water works, it changes the way that we irrigate our farms, it changes food supplies, it changes scarcity of resources, and that in itself, at a time when there are too many people on the planet, makes conflict a more prevalent issue. And I think water may well be the catalyst between India and China, ultimately, that leads to the next big war over the next 7 to 10 years.
How will resource scarcity affect us in the next few years?
Exactly that. It'll become, if you look at Darfur, and obviously there are an awful lot of sectarian killings took place. One of the statistics was that the per capita population was so high per unit resources. So human beings do a couple of things. They fight for territory and they displace their opposition. But when you're really fighting for resources, you no longer fight and displace, you kill. So the thing I think that we can maybe ask ourselves a question of is that even the Second World War had in the majority territorial aims. I think actually the next wars will be wars of annihilation where you remove the competitor for resources completely. It makes war more total in the future. And it makes it more inevitable because the only reason man has ever gone to war is for resources. We use political, we use religious reasoning to cajole our populations to unify in that act of conflict, but it's about resources. It always has been and it always will be.
Will disease and famine play a big role?
Disease and famine are also part of the empire cycle. We get stressed and we get colds because we're stressed. And disease and epidemics, I believe, are linked to the collective organisation and state of the empire cycle. So when you build an empire, you become more coherent and organised, and you push back endemic diseases like mosquitoes and malaria. And as you lose your organisational structure, those endemic diseases come back and encroach upon your civilization or adapt. And also when you're more stressed, collective immune systems are lower. And I think in the West, strangely enough, although we have a better public health system, the general sense of immune system and well-being of the Western population is probably less than the Eastern population, simply because we work harder, we have less control over our environment, we have less pride over our societies. And there are some great experiments done with rats, and they were giving them electric shocks and pain, and the rat that pressed the button that thought he was modifying the pain survived it. And the one that thought they had no control over the pain and the environment actually died. And so I think control is part of collective immune systems or perceptions of control. So yes, I think the West is actually could well be subject to disease processes that are pretty difficult and dangerous to cope with.
How do you see the next 20 years playing out?
And you see the next 10. Well, core to the commodity issue is a Kondratiev cycle. Started in 2000 and would peak around 2025. Each of those peaks produces conflicts and has done historically. So there will be a conflict, and I think this conflict is even worse than the previous ones because too few resources for too many people all wanting to industrialise. I think we face the prospect of a third world war anywhere from 2017 onwards, and the remilitarisation of China, or the militarisation of China, is going full steam ahead. In the West, we're oblivious to this process that was very similar to the turn of the 20th century when Europe armed itself prior to the First World War and the 30s, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. The nations around China are being forced to respond. There's going to be a strategic realignment with an alliance between India and America and Australia and Japan, and hopefully Russia, which contains or tries to contain China, and this massive powerhouse. Never before has an aspiring empire had 25% of the world's population, and never has it had 50% males. That's 5% above the 51 norm, which means with 60 million men around the age of 20, they can lose and still have a balanced society. And also China is controlled by its military, not by its body politic. It's a dictatorship.
David Murrin, thank you very much.